I came to my topic somewhat by accident. I was in a Russian archive a couple of summers ago, and the archivist told me I couldn't see the files I wanted to see on a Jewish rabbi who had converted to the Russian Orthodox Church, so I found myself wandering the card catalog. As I'm wandering the card catalog, I find an entry for Mormons, and I thought, well, I probably ought to look at that and see what it says at least, knowing that there weren't really any Russians or Mormons in the Russian Empire. I was all the more confused by that. So I started looking into it, and what I found was a fairly intriguing story. Here's just a couple of dates, key dates for the history of the Latter-day Saints and the Russian Empire, and then again at the fall of the Soviet regime. You can see in 1990 we rededicate the Russian land for missionary work. In early 1913, the Russian newspaper, the Kolokol, carried a short news article about rumors circulating in the village of Nikolaevsky in Samara province, which is there, you can see, located in the southern part of Russia, that outlined a series of religious initiation rites that involved secret acts with young girls. The article, titled "On Freedom of Conscience," argued that a group of Mormons carried out secret rites within their large homes. These Mormony, the author suggested, was a sect of religious fanatics who lived communally in the village, and included in their number were wealthy farmers, peasants, elderly women, and children. The Mormons were, according to the article, subjected with some regularity to the scoffing and laughing of the local peasants, who perpetuated a broad range of rumors about the community's members. If we were to search our own church records for this period, we would not find a significant or any Mormon community in Samara, and we would not find them really anywhere in the Russian Empire, except for perhaps in the Finnish Duchy, where about 200 converts joined the church in the period of 20 years between 1875 and 1895. Who then were these Samara Mormons, and where did they come from? What did they believe? How did they practice their religion? These questions, as interesting as they are to us today, were even more important for the Russian imperial government in 1913. In order to understand why, I think we have to look for a second at the nature of the Russian Empire. Russia was what one historian has called a confessional empire. The empire was confessional in the sense that it privileged Russian Orthodoxy above all other religions, even though within its borders lived a broad range of religious and ethnic groups that identified themselves as Jews, Orthodox, Lutherans, Muslims, Buddhists, and many others. Included in this was a range of animistic religious groups, as well as a large number of sects that fell under the umbrella term Duchovny Christiana, or spiritual Christians, or sectarians. One definition that I found for this group suggests that we only ought to use the term spiritual Christians when generally referring to the non-Orthodox, non-Jewish, non-Muslim, and similar faiths in Old Russia, whose ancestral ethnicity may be a mixture of Russian, Tatar, Ukrainian, Armenian, Mordvin, Chuvash, Finn, German, etc. A definition so broad that it is hardly helpful. The imperial government tightly controlled all religious activities in the Russian Empire, including conversion, liturgical developments, and even identified its population in terms of their religious affiliation. In the Russian Empire, conversion was as much a political act as it was a personal preference or result of spiritual promptings. It was illegal to convert away from Russian Orthodoxy until 1905, although you could certainly enter into Christianity, you could not go the other way. In order to do so, one needed to submit a series of letters, testimonials, letters of recommendation to local church authorities, state bureaucrats, and in some cases, even the Ministry of Internal Affairs, which housed the secret police, and in exceptional cases, the Tsar himself. So when this Kolokol article was printed, the negative portrayal of the Mormony, the Russian government responded in just the same way it would have responded to any other supposedly heretical or subversive religious movement. It initiated at the local level and later at the state level official investigations into this group of Mormons. In the case of these Mormons, the local population had already begun this process. And so what I'm trying to do today is look at two reports that I found in the archives that talk about this incident where a group of Mormons were accused, in some cases arrested, of being heretics and doing improper acts in terms of their children and women, and look at what that does in terms of how Russians thought about the Mormon church in the late 19th and early 20th century. So what I'm trying to do is understand how far the understanding of Mormonism reached by 1913 into Russia, in a place where there were no Mormons. In a sense, what I'm trying to do with these reports is highlight the interplay between the center and the periphery in the Russian Confessional Empire, while also testing, as it were, 19th century knowledge of American Mormonism. In the Kolokol article, the persecutory tone attempted to build a case against the religious sect based on unacceptable sexual practices, suspicious, that is, unorthodox religious rites, and a seemingly offensive communal lifestyle. After the article appeared in the press, a local Samara court authority, Yevgeny Minkin, wrote to the governor of the Samara province and included with the letter 7 clippings of the article, along with a plea that, quote, "Your Excellency not deny the facts listed in this report," end quote. Minkin's request remained unanswered or taken seriously until much later in the year, in September 1913, when another bureaucratic arm of the Russian government, the Ministry of Internal Affairs, got involved. The ministry apparently heard more rumors of this group in the area and understood that the Mormons were causing havoc in Nikolaevsky. Letters were sent to the government petitioning for assistance in dealing with this aberrant sect of Mormons and religious fanatics, and by mid-1914, the local population began calling for the local Mormony to be removed from the village. According to this letter, to one of the letters, the Mormony in nearby villages were rather troublesome and difficult for the local population to deal with on a daily basis. And indeed, in March of 1913, the local population held a secret town meeting in which they determined to ask for assistance in, quote, petitioning for the removal of followers of the Mormony's religious sect and the complete removal of them from our society, end quote. These reports followed a fairly formulaic pattern, as things tended to do in the Russian Empire, and proceeded to accuse Mormons, this group of Mormons, of poor treatment of women, polygamy, and portrayals of poor health and filth among some of its members. Now, within this report, what I found most interesting was there's sort of a unstated maneuvering around the idea or question of, are these American Mormons? And indeed, if we look at some of their claims about polygamy and some of their understandings of the way that these meetings proceeded within this religious sect, we get an understanding of what they knew and what they didn't know about Mormonism. At stake in all of this, however, is the threat of potential conversion of individuals from Orthodoxy to another, perhaps more charismatic religious sect. Now, in the final years of Nicholas II's reign, a last-ditch effort to reassert Russian national sentiment based on Russian Orthodoxy led to a broad range of official and unofficial searches into this mysterious world of the Russian spiritual Christian Mormonis. Another report from another city, from Baku, down in the Caspian Sea, is even more instructive in our search to understand who these people were or what the Russians thought they were. From 1912 until 1915, local leaders in Baku began arresting Mormoni, and about 15 were arrested in total, and tried to figure out where they came from and what they believed. Because of Baku's central location on the Caspian Sea, it was not out of the realm of possibility that, in fact, there may have been a small group of individuals who had met early Mormon missionaries in the Near East and elsewhere. In this report and the arrests about these Mormoni, the questions that officials asked or sought to answer involved those associated with specific differences between other spiritual Christian groups, particularly the Skopje, the Molokans, and the Mormons. Spiritual Christians, broadly speaking, this umbrella term, tended to be pacifistic, draw upon apocalyptic renderings of Scripture, and generally refuse the Orthodox sacraments. They also objected to church ecclesiastical authority and rejected icons as necessary for worship, which in Russia is cause for treason. Some of them chose to drink milk in protest, hence the name Molokans, as drinking milk was forbidden by Orthodox tradition on fast days. Others valued self-castration, that was the skopsi, and others chose to, quote, wrestle in spirit. These are the duchobors. The term Mormony was used interchangeably with other titles by opponents of the spiritual Christians to suggest a deviant sexual culture that promoted immorality, a hostility towards church authority, and a downplaying of the place of the Bible within Christianity. On the Russian frontier where these groups lived, the term spiritual Christians was broadly used to define any and all sectarian movements, with the distinctions between them often confused or used interchangeably. Within the 1913 report, the government looked specifically at the case of one Pavel Yevdokimov Ryashenetsov, who was labeled a, quote, Mormon leader in the report, and who decided upon the desire to attach himself via conversion to the Molokans, who were the milk drinkers. While the Russian government could hardly tightly control the movement of spiritual Christians from one sect to the other, as they could from Judaism to Russian Orthodoxy, for instance, they became deeply concerned when they started investigating this Mormon leader's family. Accusations of polygamy ran rampant, and the threat of polygamy in the Russian Empire raised flags among Russian authorities because of the long history of the spiritual Christians of mutilating their own bodies, mutilating the bodies of others, and their deviant sexual practices. In doing so, the investigator became preoccupied with the pattern of worship and the practices within the prayer house. Almost within a sentence, the investigator switches from talking about polygamy to talking about what the Mormons do in their religious services. So he talks about, it says, it is observed that for prayer, the sectarians often meet in their homes, sing psalms and other spiritual songs. However, no statute or regulation that precisely defined the essence of the teaching of the local Mormons is available to us. We have not observed any instance of polygamy, and know only that their chief goal is to, quote, obtain the Holy Ghost. A major focus within many of the letters is also this idea of polygamy, and the belief that Mormons practiced polygamy, and that women were somehow subjected to abuse within this religious group. In cases where these factors could not be proven, the government investigators seemed willing to let individual jurisdiction over fall to the local priest, Orthodox priest that is, and let him settle the issue. Okay, thank you. Ultimately, Leonid Pospielov, who was the local priest in Baku, declared that, in fact, Ryazhentsov Mormonism, quote, bears no resemblance to the American Mormon sect, and even went so far as to argue that there were two distinct communities, the American Mormons, who did not exist in Russia, he pointed out, and the Russian Mormons. The report went on to shun American Mormonism in the end because ultimately it concluded Baku region and Samara region Mormons don't have anything in common with American Mormons because among Russian Mormons, there is no polygamy or theocracy that exists among American Mormons, end quote. It is interesting that the two definitive American Mormon traits that emerged out of a lengthy investigation into a heretical group were polygamy, which was no longer practiced, of course, in 1913, and the claim of theocracy. Theocracy was not a foreign idea at this time to Russian rulers, nor to the Russian Orthodox Church, and indeed a significant group of Russian Silver Age literary figures, Vladimir Solovyov, Sergei Bulgakov, Pavel Florensky, all extensively wrote about this idea and developed ideas about a future world when theocracy would reign. So my question then is, how did any of these individuals in Baku and Samara and elsewhere know anything about American Mormonism? A little bit of research further into the archives showed that, in fact, there was a broad knowledge of American Mormonism beginning about 1850 or 1860 in the Russian Empire. For instance, between the 11th and the 13th of January, 1889, Lev Tolstoy, the great writer, recorded the following in his journal. I've had dinner and want to write up the days I missed. Made a few rough entries. Read the Mormon's Bible, talking about the Book of Mormon here, which he'd received, of course, from Brigham Young's daughter, and the life of Smith, talking about Cannon's life of Joseph Smith, the prophet. And he goes on, and I was horrified. Yes, religion is a work of deceit. Lies for a good purpose. 2 days later, Tolstoy continued. Read about the Mormons and understood the whole story. Yes, here's a glaringly obvious example of that deliberate deceit, which is a part of every religion. I even wondered whether this element of conscious fabrication, not cold-blooded fabrication, he goes on, but a poetic, enthusiastic half-belief in itself, isn't an exclusive sign of what is called religion. I find it interesting that Tolstoy uses American Mormonism to launch into his crisis with organized religion generally. He goes on and talks about Christ and Paul in that same discourse. There you see the younger Tolstoy, not the sort of familiar one with the long beard and hermit-like. Another avenue for knowledge about Mormons and Mormonism for 19th century Russians was the expansive Tsерковный Вестник, or the Church Bulletin, which was published by the St. Petersburg Orthodox Theological Academy and would have been read by nearly every priest, professor, and many government bureaucrats at the time. In September 1877, the journal published an obituary of the prophet Brigham Young. Brigham Young figured prominently only 1 year earlier in the detailed history of the American religion in the same journal, simply titled Mormony. This article is important because it shows the degree to which the writers, and by extension many of the readers, were familiar with the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and the migration to Salt Lake City, an object of some fascination for many of them. Within the obituary of Brigham Young, his many wives figured perhaps more prominently than he did, particularly Anne Eliza, who bajala, or ran, to New York. Polygamy, again, like it did in the reports, gaining perhaps the supreme interest for this subject. In 1879, the same journal, the Tsерковный Вестник, also carried a brief article titled Religious Sects in America that supplied the following statistical data on the church. Quote, now in Utah there are over 120,000 Mormons. In Europe, 30 to 40,000 members. 2,400 in Australia, 3,500 in the Sandwich Islands, and some in Asia, Africa, Scotland, Wales, and Ireland. Indeed, what we find is there was a broad range of knowledge, some of it correct, some of it entirely incorrect, but they were fascinated with this Mormon movement in America, particularly the move west. Okay, I'll finish right now. What I found is that, indeed, there were many paths to knowledge about American Mormonism for Russians, not just educated, but also for the broad reading public. A discussion of American Mormons appear in novels and journals, in many literary places. And so finally, what I found by examining the way that Russians talked about American Mormons, I found that indeed, as the brochure of this symposium suggests, the global reach of Mormonism transcended borders and reached into places where there were Mormoni, but no Mormons. Thank you.